Hannon Show from Westwood One Radio. We're at 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. Online, find us at JimboHannonShow.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Jimbo Talks. And delighted to have you with us tonight as we're joined by a former undercover agent and best-selling author, Robert Mazur. He has written The Betrayal, published by Little A, and subtitled The True Story of My Brush with Death in the World of Narcos and Launderers. Wow. Good evening, Robert.
Good evening. Thanks for having me back, Jim.
Absolutely. I have to ask, just as an opener here for all of those who are curious, what got you into this line of work? I'll be very honest with you. I'm very grateful there are people like you out there. I'm not one of them.
Well, I think it was pretty much accidental. When I went to college, I was a business administration finance major with emphasis in accounting. I thought I was going to become a CPA, and I went to a jobs board because it was a hard economic time, and saw this thing that said that they were looking for a, quote, co-op student in a law enforcement agency known at the time as the Intelligence Division of IRS, which is kind of an oxymoron. But anyway, the bottom line is that agency, which is an extremely effective agency, is responsible for enforcing the criminal tax statutes. And we were going after mobsters, corrupt politicians, drug traffickers. And when I got into the office, and believe me, at that time I was making coffee and copies, but I saw a lot. And one of the things I saw was that one of the groups was working on a case that later became the movie American Gangster, which was all about Frank Lucas, who was a heroin trafficker in New York. And that, played by Denzel Washington in that movie. And I saw the duffel bags of cash going into banks and the millions, tens of millions of dollars that were being created by criminal organizations, and saw the power of following the money to the corrupt leaders of criminal organizations. And it just captured me. And I thought, gosh, this is going to be a lot more exciting than counting widgets for an accounting firm. So I decided to join that agency, and I was there for a while and went on from there to other law enforcement agencies and ultimately to the Drug Enforcement Administration, which focuses, of course, on drug traffickers globally.
Maybe assume that whatever else you got from this career, that excitement was one of the things.
That's true. Excitement for sure. I was also awakened to something that I think most of us don't get to see. There's this silent control of 95% of us by 5% of the world that is so immensely involved in massive criminal activity that we don't even know that it's there. And once you see it and you become a part of it, which I had the opportunity to do for 5 years, it kind of scars you in a way, in that you begin to realize that there's this silent world that's affecting us so, unfortunately, tremendously. And today we see it in the massive amounts of corruption around the world. It scares me. It scares me for the thought of the world that my grandkids are inheriting, to see that presidents of countries, defense secretaries of defense in Mexico, presidents in Honduras, many different nations are just completely controlled by these criminal organizations. So, yeah, excitement in a way, but a startling, scary thought about what we're passing on to next generations.
At what point did you first realize this is not a game? These people would kill me in an instant if they knew who I was.
As I got deeper and deeper into Pablo Escobar's Medellín Cartel, because there were two operations. I wrote the book about the first one, which was The Infiltrator, that ultimately became a film that starring Bryan Cranston by the same name, who played me in that film. And then subsequently now the second undercover operation in the book, The Betrayal. But as I was in the first one, in The Infiltrator, I remember distinctly a day that I was there with my partner in San Jose, Costa Rica, and we were meeting with leaders of the Medellín Cartel. And during the course of the meeting, it was made very, very clear to us that our joining had put our lives in danger, and that if we should ever not do or be who we said we were, there wasn't a hole there wasn't a hole on this planet that I could hide in where they wouldn't find me and kill me. And I remember after that meeting, because I'm super cautious about security stuff, and I had my partner and I took a walk, and oddly enough, near this hotel in Costa Rica was a cemetery. So we walked among the tombstones, which was kind of really prophetic. And I said, we went hunting for the whale, and we're in the belly of the whale. And at this stage, the slightest mistake that we make could cost us our lives. And we both realized that that was in fact the case. And despite that, when I was in that world, the thing that I witnessed that changed my life so much is that I witnessed the relationship between a small segment of the international banking and business community with the underworld that enabled them to take mountains of cash and turn it into legitimate appearing enterprises that are so corrupting. And when the first operation was over, I felt as though I hadn't gone far enough to help the world to understand that evil alliance. And so I volunteered for the second operation. And unfortunately, in that second operation, I got cut short because, unfortunately, one of my undercover colleagues was on the take and the payroll of the Cali Cartel, who were our targets. And he outed me to the leadership and almost got me killed. So after that, I hung up my spikes and stopped doing the long-term undercover. But I really wish that I had gotten the opportunity to see to a true end what could have been accomplished in that second operation, but it was cut short due to corruption in our own country.
I want to get back to the corruption that you referred to, and the other story is told in the book, The Betrayal. But you're still here. Have you found a hole deep enough, or is it bygones be bygones?
I don't think it'll ever be bygones be bygones.
Yeah, that was sarcasm. obviously, you have somehow found a hole deep enough. Do you feel day to day that do you feel the fear that somebody could walk up and just shoot me?
I don't want to feel that fear because that's a very abnormal life. But there are, unfortunately, very normal things we have to do through our abnormal experience in life in order to take certain security precautions. So we take those, and it's just the way life has to be for people who choose to serve the public the way I chose to.
All right, very good. 1-866-50-JIMBO. 1-866-505-4626. Later in the program, we will, of course, be touching on truck convoys and Ukraine. But this was a story that is too good not to tell, and it is out there. It will be out there long after the truck convoys and the Ukraine story has disappeared. The pull, the appeal, the overwhelming urge to use these illegal drugs is overwhelming, and mankind really hasn't found a way to deal with this quite yet. Robert Mazur is our guest. We're happy to have him back. He's the author of The Betrayal from Little A Publishing, subtitled The True Story of My Brush with Death in the World of Narcos and Launderers. 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626, and we'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to the Jim Bohannon Show at 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. And we're talking with Robert Mazur, former undercover agent, author of The Betrayal, the true story of my brush with death in the world of narcos and launderers. Here's a call from Rick in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Hello.
Hello. I'm just, my jaw's dropping here listening to your guest, Jim. My question is to your guest, if these drug cartels could ever be limited in what they can do and the drugs coming in and their power, how far down in the food chain, for lack of a better term, or leadership, would you have to take these guys out before it would ever make an impact? You can take out the leaders and a little bit farther down, but how far down would you have to go to eradicate these people?
Great question, Robert.
Well, Jim, I think one of the things that we need to recognize is that, there are 99.9% of the law enforcement community does a great job, and unfortunately, I think about 10% of those law enforcement officers get the opportunity to make difference-making cases. And so much emphasis is on the lower-level drug trafficking. And one has to begin to wonder, when I started this back in when I started my undercover operations in 1980s and 1990s, the problem has become exponentially greater. So don't we need to face the fact that the formula that we're using in the war on drugs is failing? Not to say that we couldn't and shouldn't continue to go after the supply side and the people at the top, but are we actually focusing enough on the demand side? And I think the answer to that is no. I personally know that it's a no because I have two cousins who have died from heroin overdoses, and I have a third cousin who I spent months trying to get a bed in a state institution for treatment. And I know that for a fact, drug education and drug treatment is anemic. But more importantly, we have to face the fact that there are underserved, underprivileged segments of our community who have very little opportunity in life. And yes, we now have free education through high school, but it needs to be increased. It needs to be increased to the college level and to a level in which, if you want to go into a trade school, you get the opportunity to do that for 2 years plus if you want to go through it. And if we cannot help the underprivileged and the underserved to be able to get the opportunities that many of us enjoy, this problem is never, ever going to be solved. The money numbers, when I was working with the Medellín cartel, it cost $500 to make a kilo of cocaine. It cost $2,500 to get it transported to the United States per kilo. $3,000 investment. That was sold for $14,000 to $15,000 per kilo. So now we're talking about $12,000 in profit on each kilo. And the people I dealt with were sending 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 6,000 kilos at a time. And they were sending that multiple times, not just in the United States, but Italy and Europe. The profits are immense. So the supply side, yeah, you need to disrupt command and control. And there are units and I have to take my hat off to, and the public should look closely at a unit called the Special Operations Division within the Drug Enforcement Administration. They work with the other law enforcement agencies in our country, military, the intelligence community, and our allies in all of those same spaces. And they make cases against the biggest, baddest guys in the world. But unfortunately, that's about 50 to 60 employees out of thousands and thousands. The reality is, and part of the betrayal, and I say this in my book, part of the betrayal. Okay, I'm sitting in my office in DEA, and it's September. And my boss comes in the office, and he goes, you know what, guys, I don't care what you're working on, but you need to go to the local law enforcement agencies and adopt whatever cases we can into the federal system because our numbers are down. And, in October, our numbers are going to be gauged, and then we have to go to Congress to try to get our budgets. And so, therefore, we need numbers higher because Congress doesn't take the time to do anything other than look at how many arrests and how many seizures have been made by the agency. And that dictates their budget. Well, great. So now the lowest of the lowest on the totem pole wind up going in prison. And when you look at it, in 2020, we put 1.8 million people were incarcerated. 1.8 million. And of those 1.8 million, in the cheapest of the circumstances in states, it was about $25,000 a year to maintain that person. In some, it was $60-some thousand a year. Wouldn't you rather put that toward an education than an education about crime?
All right, let's talk a bit more about that.
Need to be looked at.
Let's talk a bit more about that. I certainly have no problem with the slogan, nor with the application of the slogan, but just say no is not enough. What kind of treatment does it take? If you're on something like heroin, for example, that's pretty hard to get off of, isn't it?
It absolutely, certainly is. Extraordinarily hard to get off of. You need the help of true professionals, medical professionals, in order to be able to get off of that. But the big question is, how do you keep people from getting on to that? And what was the story of most of the people who were involved in now the fentanyl nightmare that this nation faces, and the heroin problem that this nation faces, and many others, methamphetamine, cocaine, PCP, you name it, it's all out there. The treatments that need to be provided need to be improved. But I think we need to get ahead of the treatment. We need to figure out, how do those people get on that, and what is it that we can do to divert a lot of the people who otherwise go to that, to consider that to be their option in life.
And I don't mean to oversimplify here, but how they get on it? I mean, hey, it's a kick, it's a high. I mean, isn't that how pretty much is a casual decision? Nobody thinks about the consequences. Hey, I'm looking for a kick, I'm looking for a high. Heroin will do it. I mean, isn't that about as deep as most people go?
Well, I guess it depends on what your roots are from, Jim. You and I have been blessed. I know I was blessed.
I am absolutely blessed. I've never had the slightest inkling of a desire to do anything like that.
Right. Well, and there are some people who come from a no-parent environment, or a one-parent environment, or a completely different type of environment, but that's the norm. That's what's expected. And, that has to stop. That's not acceptable. We need to try to divert people away from that interest. And the best way to do that is to give them an option. Could you imagine, Jim, if you had an option, and your option is you can exist within the squalors of an existence that you have and try your damnedest to try to get out? And believe me, there are people who've done that. There's some wonderful, tremendous success stories, but there are a lot more horror stories than there are success stories.
Are you suggesting that we need to provide a stable nuclear family for every person in America? Because that's a great, lofty goal, but it's impossible.
No, I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm just suggesting that we give a real opportunity to people who really want to get an education and to try to break the chain that they are otherwise confined within. Those that don't want to find that, we're never going to be able to help. That's just an unfortunate situation, an unfortunate reality that we're not going to be able to help. No, I'm not suggesting that we become somehow an effort to try to provide the best of the best to anybody who doesn't want that type of assistance. But I'm just saying that there are people out there who don't have options, and I think that to a certain extent, we need to try to help those individuals. But this is a terrible problem that it's on so many levels. Can you imagine that today's reality is that the president of Honduras' brother is in prison in the United States for life because he was a major facilitator of the transshipment of drugs for the Mexican and Colombian cartels into the United States, making huge, huge amounts of money and filling the coffers of many senators and presidents, and corrupting.
These are senators and presidents in that Central American nation. We'll come back with more as the break is approaching. Our guest again, Robert Mazur, author of The Betrayal. Back in a moment. Welcome back to the Jim Bohannon Show at 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. Many of us could write a book, how I became the best speaker of the year at the local Rotary Club. I could write about some various awards I've picked up for yakking into a microphone. Robert Mazur has written a book titled The Betrayal. It's from Little A Publishing and subtitled The True Story of My Brush with Death in the World of Narcos and Launderers. Outside my experience. Gil calls in from Manila, the Philippines. Hello, Gil.
Yes, good evening, Jim, and good evening to your guest. Having lived a long time in El Paso, Texas, and in Mexico, I have a couple of comments and a question for your guest. Sir, did you have any involvement in Operation Casablanca in 1998?
I wasn't personally involved, but I know about the operation.
For the rest of us who do not, how about a quick briefing?
It was a customs operation that was a infiltration of some Mexican banks that were involved in money laundering, and it was an operation focused on going after launderers of drug proceeds.
Okay. What else, Gil?
Well, if I can add a little bit to that. Operation Casablanca, U.S. agents went to Mexico, identified the bankers that were doing most of this money laundering. Most of them were HSBC bankers, as I recall.
I guess that was...
I don't know if they were HSBC. There were quite a few Mexican banks. And after you've gone to where you want to go with this, I'm so happy that you brought up this issue about banks.
Yeah, I want to ask you about, are these banks legitimate banks? I go down to my bank, even though I no longer have a bank that's locally owned, of course, it's some big conglomerate, but my respectable bank, are they involved in all of this? I mean, I tend to think I hear about banks that launder cash and handle all this stuff. I think, well, thank goodness that's not my bank. Is it?
I'm going to give you a complicated answer. Okay. Yes. It is your bank.
Wow. Okay.
And your guest brought up a wonderful question about Casablanca, which had exposed the activity of these criminal bankers, and many of the cases, if they even got into court, were overturned with respect to the bankers themselves. But in my book, I address about 16 banks. Major international banks. Yeah. Some of them banks, American banks, British banks, Italian banks, you name it. HSBC is probably a very good example, as your listener brought up the HSBC. HSBC paid $1.9 billion in fines when they were found to be, among other things, laundering money for the Mexican and the Cali and one of the Norte de Valle cartel in Colombia. But here's the amazing thing. Not one person, not one individual was found personally responsible. Our Assistant Attorney General and our Attorney General at the time, Eric Holder, said that the bank was simply involved in a situation where they had a systems problem that they had intentionally failed to maintain.
What the hell is that supposed to mean? A systems problem?
Yeah, no, they had intentionally failed to maintain an anti-money laundering program. And so, therefore, there was no one individual who was responsible. It was just that this was overwhelming, huge amounts of transactions, and nobody could figure it out. And it's garbage. The bottom line is, my feeling is that the term intentionally failing to maintain an anti-money laundering program, which is a criminal offense, which they admitted to and agreed to a deferred prosecution, is nothing short of saying, in legalese, we laundered. They had a cartel, Mexican cartel leader on the phone in an intercept who was documented to say the best place to get your money laundered is HSBC. That money was being shipped into the United States from Mexico in pallets that were on armored cars being brought in. So did Wachovia Bank, did the same thing just years before. This is not the type of thing that one can say is due to a systems failure. No. The systems failure is within the Department of Justice for failing to get individual responsibility and putting bankers behind bars for decades, which will make a huge difference.
Obviously. Yeah, that clearly is the answer. And all right, Frank in Cumberland, Maryland. Hello, Frank.
We've been losing the war on drugs for decades, and the answer is very simple. The same answer is to prohibition. You legalize drugs. You let the government treat the addicts, and as soon as they're legalized, all that profit goes out of drugs, and there's no more crime. And all you have to worry about is the addicts. And with the addicts, you just allow them to be treated by their government. They register and they're treated.
So everybody who wants to be a zombie gets to be a zombie, state subsidized, Robert? Is that how it's going to work?
Absolutely not. I mean, I'm going to tell you right now, the idea of legalizing marijuana, which was on the border of yes, no, has created a massive black market for marijuana dealers who can easily price the same product that you can get from a state-sponsored marijuana store that's charging 3 times the amount of money that you can buy it for on the street. So, I mean, that's not stopping the cartel from being involved. But do you really want your children to be able to have the opportunity, or even your brother at an adult age, to get as much methamphetamine as they want, to get as much fentanyl as they want? They're going to die on the spot because the Chinese unregulated pharmaceutical companies are pumping massive amounts of fentanyl into the cartel hands and producing this stuff on the streets. I don't believe that we can afford to take the chance of allowing all of that dangerous chemical on the streets so readily available.
Yeah,
I really do believe that's going to be a bad step.
Yeah, Al in North Dallas. Hello, Al.
Hello, Mr. Bohannon, Mr. Robert. I was just wondering, after all these years of endless drug wars, don't the authorities have some idea at this point where these cartels' stronghold or hideouts is, and why doesn't Mexico allow the U.S. military to go in there and clean house? And of course, I would like to know more about the problem with the DOJ that you just recently
Absolutely, yes. We'll certainly come back to that. I quite frankly support what Al just said wholeheartedly. In fact, I wouldn't bother asking the Mexican government for permission. I mean, I have no problem. This is essentially what's happening is an act of war in the United States. And while I certainly support all that Robert is talking about regarding the demand side, I would have no problem with destroying the demand side by blowing it up.
Well, and Jim, here's the problem. Just this past year, there was a person identified by our Drug Enforcement Administration known within the cartels by the secret name of El Padrino, the Godfather. Ultimately, we identified who the Godfather was, who was helping them to succeed as a very successful cartel. The Padrino turned out to be the Defense Secretary General, Salvador Cienfuegos of Mexico. We captured him. He was in prison in Los Angeles. And unfortunately, near the end of the last administration, some type of a deal was made where General Cienfuegos was allowed to be released back to the Mexican government, where the president at the time said, when he comes back here, we'll have him face those charges in our country and we will vigorously pursue it. 30 days later, they came out and said, oh my gosh, this evidence is just flimsy. There's nothing to this. The general never did anything wrong. That's a lie. That's an absolute lie. And my colleagues in DEA are just furious about the fact that General Cienfuegos was sent back.
Now, we are way overdue for a break here. We are way overdue for a break. Before we go to the break, this has to ask a follow-up question. Are you suggesting that somebody at the highest levels of the American government was paid off to let this guy out?
I didn't say paid off. I think there was a quid pro quo. And
well, what was the quid pro quo? Who got what? Obviously, the narco got free. What did the United States get out of this?
How could you, in your right mind, give back to the Mexican government their Secretary of Defense, who was proven beyond any reasonable doubt?
All right, you can't.
He was indicted by a grand jury.
Right.
And you gave him back, and they said in 30 days, they looked so closely into this, and he never did anything wrong.
I understand all that, which takes us back to what did the United States get out of this? You said there was a quid pro quo, briefly.
No, I'm just saying that there must have been a quid pro quo of some sort. You're not going to do that just because you're trying to be a nice guy.
Well, yeah, one would hope not. Maybe we can figure out what it might have been. If it wasn't a cash payoff, I'm hard-pressed to imagine what it might have been. And back after these messages. show at 1-866-50-JIMBO with Robert Mazur. He was a former undercover agent. He's written the book, The Betrayal, from Little A Publishing. Here is Doc in Wilmington, Delaware. Good evening.
Mr. Mazur, you, sir, are an American patriot, sir. You're an American patriot. It's a pleasure and honor to speak with you, sir. Mr. Mazur, as you well know,
Thank you.
One of the largest money laundering cases ever brought to bear was against Wells Fargo Bank in my own state of Delaware, their branch here in Delaware. Sir, two quick questions. Would you touch, please, for the listeners and for Jim's edification of my own, the role played by intelligence agencies, ours and foreign agencies, hostile and allied, in laundering drug money to finance covert operations? And second question, sir, was there ever a case that you were involved in, Mr. Mazur, that was so large, so hydra-headed, that you were told to walk away or else, and what did you do? I'll stand by and listen, sir.
Sure. Well, I'll answer your second question first. In the first deep cover operation that I did, when I was working with my partner, who I have to say is a far better undercover agent than me, Amir Abreu, great undercover agent. We infiltrated not just the Medellín cartel, but also the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI, which was the seventh largest privately held bank in the world. It had more than 500 branches. It was in 72 countries. I dealt with people on the board level of those banks. They were absolutely involved, and I got them on tape discussing their interest in laundering drug proceeds, basically helping anybody who had money they wanted to hide from governments. But as I began to work with them more and more, I began to realize that I was in a crossroad. My crossroad was that I'm dealing with officers who are dealing with drug traffickers, they're dealing with politicians, and they're dealing with the intelligence agencies of the world. The CIA had its accounts there. That scared me a lot because the covert operation that I was involved in was going to take the bank down, and it was a favored bank of the CIA. But as I sat there with the financial advisor who was assigned to work with me to launder drug proceeds, and he was on the phone with Manuel Noriega's financial advisor because he was laundering money for Manuel Noriega, it became very clear to me that I was dealing with people who were working for the intelligence agencies. There was an incident where I was...
That would be our intelligence agencies or whose?
Multiple. The ISI,
including ours? Including ours?
Including ours.
Okay, go ahead.
Including ours, absolutely, no doubt. The officer that I dealt with pointedly told me that he had opened accounts for Casey, who was the head of the CIA, who was moving money for the Mujahideen so that they could buy weapons to fight the Russians, which brings us into the situation of, we were talking before the last break about why would our country do certain things that maybe from a drug perspective doesn't make any sense. And that's because we have many, many fronts. We have an intelligence front, a law enforcement front, and the nation has to, and the leaders of the nation have to balance those things. And sometimes when they balance them, they decide against doing the right thing for the war on drugs because they think they're doing the right thing for the war on terrorism or the war on intelligence fighting with other agencies. So I wasn't trying to suggest before that anybody in the United States was filling their pockets because of decisions they made. It's because of what I think were poor decisions that were being made that were counterproductive to the war on drugs and hopeful in other wars that didn't quite succeed. But in this one particular instance, to tell you how close I was to the intelligence world, I'm sitting there across from a banker who's looking at me, and he picks up the phone and he's talking to someone, and he says, "Are you sure he is? Do you really think, is he that?" And he's looking at me while he's saying this, and I thought, well, it's somebody that outed me. And he put the phone down and he said, "We're going to have to end the meeting. My president," he was from Pakistan, he goes, "My president was just killed from a rocket that was shot by the Russians and killed your ambassador. And so we need to end this meeting." And he needed to move monies that were owned by General Zia, who was the leader of Pakistan at the time, because there were secret accounts that were there. So I went to a payphone. That tells you how old this case was. Went to a payphone and I called my office and I said, "And you must have heard about General Zia being killed and our ambassador." And they said, "We don't know what you're talking about." And it was like 6 hours, not 6 hours, let's say 2 or 3 hours before the rest of the world knew about it. That's how close to the pulse of the underworld that I was when I was inside of BCCI.
All right. We will see if we
can
possibly get to Doc's second question and some more calls when we come back in a moment. Welcome back to the Jim Bohannon Show, 1-866-50-JIMBO, as we talk with Robert Mazur, author of The Betrayal. I think we'll go with one question per caller, and here's James in Danbury, Connecticut. Hello.
How you doing, Jimbo?
Fine, thank you. What's on your mind?
I have a two-part question. Number one, we have one faction of the government that says we're fighting the war on drugs, yet you have another faction of the government that are letting it happen. Is there ever an equal balance? And secondly, we love Eric Clapton, but places like Crossroads are for people hoity-toity with a lot of money, power, and stature. Why can't we have...
Well, we'll just go with the one question per caller, as I just said. All right, is there a conflict within the government regarding the appropriate approach to drugs?
Well, there's no doubt that there's a conflict, and we go back to the issue of how do you deal with banks. You know, the government's current situation is that they want to fine banks billions of dollars, and they don't want to prosecute individuals. There are other people who are in the trenches who want to prosecute individuals.
Who doesn't want to prosecute individuals? The individuals are the people who are doing this. I mean, you've got to be either an idiot or in bed with these cartels if you don't want to prosecute individuals. I mean, that's ridiculous.
Idiot works. I don't know about the other part, but I think the bottom line is that it's a very hard and difficult job to go after individuals to get the evidence to do this.
Because your boss goes to cocktail parties with people from big banks? I mean, is it that blatant?
Well, your prior listener had asked about the Wells Fargo, which is really the Wachovia Bank case.
Right.
Put your mind around this. Wachovia Bank, in a period of less than 3 years, moved $14 billion in U.S. currency in armored cars from Mexico to the United States on behalf of what they claimed were honest account holders. They were houses of exchange, casas de cambio. You know, $14 billion, and it wasn't in hundreds, 5, 10s, and 20s, but let's say it was 20s, is 780 tons. Tell me how it is that a legitimate account relationship with account holders in Mexico can cause 780 tons of currency to be driven across the border and brought to the United States, and people not get excited about that.
Because they're obviously looking the other way. And again, that goes back to the question before. Are they flat out getting cash payoffs, or what else could possibly be in the deal here? I mean, you certainly don't get the love of your neighbors at those expensive cocktail parties. Oh, you're laundering drug money. I mean, what is it that's motivating these people?
Probably the best example I can give you is in my book, The Infiltrator, as I sat at 2 a.m. in a social club called Regine's in Miami with a banker from BCCI. And he turned to me and he said, you know who the biggest money launderer in the United States is? And I thought I was going to get a great lead and I was going to get a prosecution. And he goes, it's the Federal Reserve. I go, what do you mean the Federal Reserve? He goes, Bob, it's illegal in Colombia for anyone to have a U.S. dollar account. But the Central Bank of Colombia has what's called an anonymous window, a sinister window, and your listeners can Google it and find it's a reality where people could bring as much cash as they wanted anonymously and get it exchanged for pesos. What did that result in?
Well, unfortunately, we will not have time to find out what it could result in, but to stay on the line, please, and we'll speak off air. Robert Mazur, former undercover agent, author of the book The Betrayal from Little A Publishing, and this is Westwood One.